Everyone is familiar with that story, right? Ever since we were kids in grammar school, we heard about the Battle of Trenton. Did you know there were two battles of Trenton? There was actually one on the 26th, and then there was one about a week later when Washington made his famous retreat and then circled round the enemy lines and defeated the British at Princeton. So anyway, the weather aside, it was cold, it was damp, it was snowing, it was pitch black. We're talking, by the time George and the boys, and they were numbered about 1,600 troops, American troops, crossed the Delaware from Pennsylvania into New Jersey, about 9 miles north of Trenton, it was pitch black. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. They had 9 miles to walk over treacherous terrain to a battle which no one would ever know for certain in their minds whether they would win, lose, or run like they had been doing for the last 6 months. Ever since the British landed in New York, it's just been one defeat after another as the Continental Army went from New York down through all of New Jersey and finally across the Delaware into Pennsylvania for what they thought might be winter quarters. But Washington had one more trick up his sleeve, and this was because in 1 week's time, if Washington didn't do something, didn't get a victory, enlistments were up. And by and large, that would have been the end of the Continental Army and the end of the Revolution. So here we're going to concentrate on one of the characters who was, in fact, with Washington at that campsite across the river. And it happened to be Edward Hart, who was the 20-year-old son of John Hart, the signer that we talked about earlier. And this is what's going through his mind on the eve of the First Battle of Trenton. Freezing cold, hungry, and exhausted, Edward fretted whether the powder in his musket would be dry enough to fire properly when the lines were finally drawn. As he marched, his thoughts turned from his father's safety to Penny's warm, inviting body, her intoxicating scent. To keep himself awake and moving, he whistled the little tune he had heard her singing on the night following the horse race, when he'd stumble upon her, half naked, in the stable. How ironic, thought Edward, as he willed himself onward in foul weather and darkness, to be marching overland, owned by his maternal grandfather, Richard Scudder, and not to be able to duck in out of the cold for a pint of warm grog and a bit of news about his family. But there were spies everywhere, and his troop had been warned to stay in their ranks. In the pocket of his frayed uniform jacket, he still carried the copy of Common Sense Penny had given him to read and remember her by. It had been a long, depressing 6 months of soldiering since he'd seen her last. How would she greet him, if at all, should this battle fail? He feared but dared not consider the worst. Instead, he contemplated the uncanny clarity given his present situation, the opening words from Tom Paine's latest treatise, American Crisis, which General Washington had read aloud to his men just before they broke camp for the march to Trenton. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and the thanks of man and woman. Words never meant more to a man than did these to Edward Hart at that moment. Whatever the outcome of the battle, he was grateful to have survived his own personal crisis of conscience, making the choice to stay and fight. Okay, now we're going to flash forward to what we have envisioned as contemporary Trenton, bringing through the John Hart line a rather interesting family in present-day Trenton. John?
Just to give you a little bit of background on this part, imagine you're in modern-day Trenton. You're a man by the name of Luis Alma. That's your name, Alma. And you happen to be a groundskeeper, a caretaker, a gardener, and you've opened up your own landscaping business, and you've done well. And you've grown the business, and you're in a city that's having its troubles with violence, with gang violence. You're in Trenton. And you suffer one of the greatest losses of your life. You suffer something personal and a loss. And at that point in time, the first thought for most Latinos is, I want to go to Miami. Right? So what we did is we took a little trip to Miami in this. Having lived there, it's a nice place to go back to. So is Trenton, though. Later that evening, Padre Miguel said grace before a simple yet traditional Cuban meal prepared by Rosa. They dined gratefully on stewed chicken and fried plantains with rice and beans. After homemade flan for dessert, Tina helped Rosa clean up, and Roberto went into the living room to watch television. Miguel excused himself to prepare for tomorrow's Mass. Raul and Luis joined Uncle Rodrigo on the balcony, sitting in a worn-out wicker rocker, smoking a cigar and listening to the sounds of children playing in the soccer in the street below as darkness approached. The slight but steady old man had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout dinner. His hair was only thin white wisps where once a thick, full, dark mane reigned. Dark sunglasses covered his injured eyes, damaged long ago in an explosion at the cigar factory in Tampa, where he used to work. A hickory walking cane lay across his lap. They tell me the moon over Miami is quite a sight to behold, Rodrigo said as the two men, drinks in hand, joined him on the terrace. There was a cool, pleasant breeze blowing in off the ocean as the evening began to settle over the modest apartment building. Tell me, Raul. Raul, my son, what do you see? Raul set his glass down and peered over the railing toward the eastern sky. A big, bright yellow globo, replied Raul. So close you can almost reach out and touch it with your fingers. Ah, said Rodrigo with a satisfied sigh. Not unlike the moon we used to see on warm nights in Havana. Si, Tio Rodrigo, answered Raul, sitting beside him. The very same. Oh, then I've missed nothing, concluded Rodrigo. Luis stirred the ice in his glass with his fingers. What's it like, Uncle Rodrigo, he began, searching for the right words, to live in darkness every day? You adjust, Luis, replied Rodrigo, rocking gently. You learn to listen and look at things a little differently, to trust in your senses and find light where you can. Mulling his great-uncle's words, Luis downed his drink. The old man smelled the rum and heard the ice cubes clink against the glass. You know, we all see things differently, Luis, but I can tell you this from experience. There are very few great insights at the bottom of a bottle. Luis had expected this type of lecture from his older brother, the priest, but coming from an old blind man, the words struck a nerve, leaving him feel exposed and fragile. That's it. Okay. That's part two. Thank you. What we try to tell the story of with our book is an uplifting tale that leads you, hopefully, to the conclusion that we've come to. The founding fathers are not that distant from us. They started something pretty wonderful. There are some pretty amazing options for how we can carry it out. Modern day Trenton has a lot of problems. We all know that. No. There is hope. The hope is in its people. The hope is in our culture and in all of our different cultures that combine. And they deserve to be honored. That's what we've tried to do.